Today at the House of Hacks, we're going to cover 8 tips for soldering copper plumbing. Hi makers, builders, and do-it-yourselfers. Harley here. We've been talking in the last several episodes about soldering, and this is the third in the trilogy where we're going to be talking about tips for soldering copper plumbing. If you've already subscribed to House of Hacks, I just want to give you a great big thanks for joining me as we go through this creative journey that we're on together. If you haven't subscribed, I'd encourage you to go check out the channel and see if it's something you're interested in. Tip number 1 is to use a tubing cutter. This is a medium-sized one, and this is a little tiny baby one. The advantage of this one is it gets in small places where you may be constrained on space. This one is the one that I prefer though because it's bigger and you have more leverage. You've got more leverage on the handle where you're turning the knob to tighten things down, and you also have more leverage when you're turning the tubing cutter around. Get one of these if you're going to be working with copper tubing to any great extent. They're really easy to use. They make a really nice clean cut. They make things go a whole lot faster. Tip number 2 is to remove the burrs. There's 2 easy ways of doing this. The first is to use a part of the cutter that comes with the tubing cutter. It has a little triangular piece that you can ream out the burrs with. The other is to use a rat tail file. These work equally well if you use either a tubing cutter that doesn't have a burr removal, or if you're using a hacksaw to cut it. Tip 3 is to clean the pipes. You want to make sure that it has a nice bright shiny surface on it. The way that I prefer to do that is to use one of these little brush tools that are designed for pipes. It has 2 sizes, 3/4 and 1/2 inch for the 2 most common pipe sizes, and it has holes. It has holes for getting the outside of the pipe, and it has little brushes that fit on the inside to clean out the insides. If you don't have one of these brushes, emery cloth works really well too. It's just a little bit more of a pain to use. Tip number 4 is for those situations where you're working on plumbing that has already had water put in it. Of course, you want to turn the water off first, make sure there's no pressure on it before you cut into it, otherwise you're going to have a big mess. But sometimes there's residual water that remains in the pipes that's hard to get out. And any water that happens to be in the pipe will pull heat away from the joint, it'll vaporize and just make the whole job much more difficult. A great way to get around that is a little piece of bread. All you have to do is take this and stuff it in the pipe, push it up as far as you can with your finger, make sure it's got enough in there to be packed in there pretty good, and that'll keep the water from coming down into your joint, and after you're all done, the water, when you turn it back on, will just wash it all away. It's a great way to keep water from interfering with your plumbing joint. And then you can slather butter on the rest of the bread and take a break to have enough energy for the rest of the project. Tip number 5 is to use Flux. It might be a little tempting to try to get by without it, but you really don't. This makes the project work a whole lot better. Tip number 6 is to have a fire extinguisher or water on hand. You don't want to be burning down the house. Tip number 7 is for those cases where you're working around wood or other combustible materials. Make sure you have a heat shield. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a bit of metal that will keep the heat away from the combustible material. And be sure to use pliers to hold it, otherwise it may get hot and you may end up burning yourself instead of the house. Tip number 8. Once you've turned the water back on, you need to be sure to check for leaks. And a great way of doing that is to use a piece of tissue paper or toilet paper. Both will work equally well. You just rub this around the joint and it will change color and swell up if you have any water leaks. Great way of doing that. Thanks for joining me on this creative journey we're on. If you've already subscribed, again, I want to give you a great big thanks for supporting this channel and for going along on this journey on a continuing basis with me. If you're new to House of Hacks, I believe everyone has a God-given creative spark. Sometimes this manifests through making things with a mechanical or technical bent to them. Around here at House of Hacks, I like to do things out of wood, metal, electronics, and photography. So if you're interested in these kind of projects, how-tos, tutorials, and that sort of thing, I'd encourage you to subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next video. Until then, go make something. Perfection's not required, fun is.